Hello, everybody. Welcome to this side event at the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty Preparatory Committee, currently taking place in Vienna. Signatory states from across the globe have come together to discuss how to make progress on nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation. In that context, our event is entitled, "Can Nuclear Weapons Ever Deliver Real Security?" At a time when we're closer to nuclear war than ever before, this is an urgent question. Is it now even conceivably arguable that nuclear weapons prevent war? We have a fantastic panel here today to discuss these burning issues. So our panel comprises Aidan Liddle, the UK ambassador to the Conference on Disarmament. We hope to be joined very shortly by Ribeiro-Addy MP, Vice Chair of Parliamentary CND. We have Trish Whitham with us from the Nuclear Information Service. She's the coordinator of NIS. And of course, Dr. Rebecca Johnson, a CND Vice President, and also from Acronym Institute and ICAN. So a great team. Thank you so much to our speakers for joining us. Once our panel has made their contributions, around 8 minutes each, we'll look to you, our audience, for questions and comments. We'll have plenty of time to hear from you all. So please put your questions in the Q&A box. You can wait till the speakers are finished. You can add them as you go along, as you think of them. And then once the contributions have ended from the panelists, I'll put those questions to them. So again, thank you all for joining us. First of all then, over to Aidan Liddle. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Kate, and thanks to your team for setting this up and getting us together. So I'm joining you live from the Vienna International Centre, downstairs in the main plenary room. The debate in the preparatory committee, the first session of the preparatory committee, is ongoing, and in fact we're talking at the moment about cluster 1, the disarmament pillar of the treaty. I made my intervention this morning, but I'm very happy to talk perhaps later on about what's going on here in Vienna and how the preparatory committee works and what we're up to. But obviously the focus of this session is slightly broader than that. It's about the question, as Kate said, about the relationship between nuclear weapons and security, and can nuclear weapons ever provide security? So, I mean, the question, the answer really for us is set out in the integrated review in 2021, which of course many of you will be familiar with. But it's worth sort of starting from first principles, really. What do we mean by security? The integrated review, actually, in the government's perception or conception, I should say, of security is quite a broad one. I mean, the integrated review covers development policy, climate change, global health issues, and all sorts of questions. If you sort of zoom into what you might call hard security, although it's not a term I particularly like, but it's a useful shorthand, I suppose, in this context. What we talk about when we talk about security is basically countering threats to the United Kingdom as an entity, as a territory, and of course including our dependent territories around the world, but also more broadly our society, our way of life, and the institutions and the values that underpin that. Leaving aside questions of things like pandemics and climate change and other threats to our security broadly drawn, the sorts of things we're talking about, I think, in this segment, if you like, of security, are things ranging from disinformation, cyber attacks, political interference, espionage, supply chain disruption, all those things that would affect our day-to-day life in the country, all the way up to, or undermine the institutions, of course, that run that sort of comprise the state, if you like, all the way up to the sort of classical, if you like, threats to our territorial integrity, and the existence of the UK as a state. So obviously that's a very broad range of threats, and the task when you're talking about security, countering those threats, is to detect, disrupt, defend against, and deter those threats. Happily, those things all begin with D, although I don't know if that's deliberate. So in this context, when we talk about deterrence, so as I said, detect, disrupt, defend, and deter. Deterrence means trying to stop those threats arising or materializing in the first place, trying to persuade an adversary not to act in a way that would cause harm to the country. Broadly speaking, when we talk about deterrence, we talk about two sort of ways of doing this. One is to essentially make it so hard to achieve the effect an adversary wants to that it's not worth their while, and sometimes we call this deterrence by denial. So that's classically done by sort of, you know, raising your defences or making it very, very hard for an adversary to actually succeed in what they want to do, so it's not worth their while. The other way of doing it is to convince an adversary that the costs that we would impose on them for acting in a certain way or attacking us would outweigh any benefit they could hope to derive from mounting that sort of attack. This is sometimes called deterrence by punishment, but it's essentially a sort of I mean, these are both effectively ways of trying to influence the calculations of an adversary not to behave in a way that would cause us harm. So it's trying to stop an attack or an aggressive maneuver arising in the first place. Now, deterrence in both of those aspects can be achieved using a whole range of tools, and effectively it's a sort of psychological strategy in a way. You know, you are influencing somebody else to behave in a certain way, or not to behave rather in a certain way. And you can achieve this in lots of different ways, and across all sort of domains of action, to put it in that sense. And then we come to nuclear weapons. Now, nuclear weapons play a unique and a very specific role in this sort of spectrum, this toolbox of deterrence, which in itself is simply one tool in protecting the country or countering threats to the country. So as you will know, again, from the integrated review, the fundamental purpose of our nuclear weapons is to preserve peace, prevent coercion, and deter aggression. Again, that D word, deter. And what we say is that we would only consider using nuclear weapons in extreme circumstances of self-defense, including the defense of our NATO allies. So this is a very, very specific set of circumstances at the very extreme end of those threats that I outlined earlier. We don't pretend that nuclear weapons are the only guarantee of our national security in all its aspects, broadly drawn. You know, you don't sort of talk about nuclear deterrence, you know, as being a deterrent against all threats that the UK faces. But they do underpin our response to the most serious threats, those most extreme existential threats that we and our allies might possibly face. Again, these I hope are extremely remote circumstances, but of course, as you know, these are threats that we have faced before in our history, and as Russia's attack on Ukraine reminds us, these are not threats that have gone away in the 21st century, even though we rather hoped they had done. So that's how we see nuclear weapons in the UK's national security concept. The second part of the question is, in what way does the NPT contribute to international security? And I think we see this in two ways. Firstly is that the NPT provides a framework for the negotiation of nuclear disarmament amongst the 5 nuclear weapon states recognized by the NPT. And that would be done, you know, on a mutual basis, and in a way that takes account of the importance of maintaining stability as we reduce nuclear weapons ultimately to zero. So that's the first way in which the NPT contributes to international security. And of course, the hope is that that world without nuclear weapons, once the five have got rid of them, would be, of course, a safer world than we have now. Although that's contingent on a much wider conversation about international governance. The second way in which the NPT contributes to international security is by stopping the further spread of nuclear weapons, or the spread of weapons to more states, whilst keeping open the possibility and indeed the right of all countries to use nuclear-derived technologies for peaceful purposes. I mean, it goes without saying, I think, that the global situation, of course, would be exponentially more complicated the more these weapons spread to other actors, states, of course, but not to mention non-state actors.
Aidan, just to let you know, you've had your 8 minutes.
Just wrapping up.
Thank you.
Yes. I'm just wrapping up. So that's the second way in which we feel that the NPT contributes to international security, and why the NPT and why the PrepComm that I'm engaged with here today is so important. For reasons of time, I won't rehearse the reasons, the ways in which the UK is implementing its obligations under Article 6 of the treaty, but I'm sure that will come up in discussion. But it's really important, I think, to have this sort of discussion framing what the NPT does and the conversations we're having here in that broader context. I'm really looking forward to the perspectives of the other panelists and the discussion to follow. Thanks.
Thanks very much indeed, Aidan. That's great. So I see that Belle Ribeiro-Addy MP has now joined us. Welcome, Belle. We were going to take you next because you have to leave earlier, I think. Are you okay to go now?
Yeah, I am. Thank you so much. And my apologies, had some issues getting on, but I'm really, really pleased to be speaking today. And I always think it's important when as many of us do, the issue of the amount of nuclear weapons that we are, and the more that governments around the world seem to be content in stockpiling them and even threatening to use them, as we have seen, should be an issue of greater importance, especially when we look at what they can now do. And we know that in the next week, it will mark the day in which bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And when I think back to what happened then, how many lives were lost, I also think of the very, very real fact that actually the capability of the weapons that we have now are far, far worse. The damage would be far, far worse. And we know that with Putin's invasion of Ukraine, that's definitely raised the nuclear threat to the highest level that we've seen since the Cold War. And, you know, we've heard the former Russian president, Medvedev, sounding off this week, claiming that if Ukraine's counteroffensive against Moscow's invasion captures Russian territory, Russia is prepared to use strategic nuclear weapons. And we also saw Poland this week move troops to the eastern border in response to Russia's autocratic ally, Belarus, training Wagner mercenaries in close proximity. Now, none of the analysts saw Putin's invasion of Ukraine coming. So why should we trust them when we say it's unlikely that we're going to see further nuclear escalation? And as the war in Ukraine rages on, the Stockholm Institute for Peace reported that there are an estimated 12,512 warheads globally. Nearly 10,000 of these are in military stockpiles and ready for potential use, and that's an increase of about 86 on 2022 figures. Now, this increase marks at the end of a period of gradual decline that we saw before the end of the Cold War. The Stockholm International Peace Institute also suggested that the 6 new warheads were held by China, and the other new weapons were attributed to Russia. 12 of them, Pakistan have 5, North Korea, also 5 in India, 4, and it points that the UK has not increased its nuclear arsenal in 2022. However, it also makes clear that our warhead stockpile is expected to grow in future, thanks to the government's announcement in 2021 that it will raise its limit from 225 to 260 warheads. So what is it we're doing here in the UK? We do have the UN Treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, which came in force in 2021, and banning their use under international law. And we know that nuclear weapons have always been immoral, but now many states consider them illegal. It's been signed by the TPNWs by 122 countries so far, but not ours. And in fact, in that very same year, the UK government actually announced plans to increase the stockpile by 40%. Last year, on behalf of the CND, I attended the UN Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons conference in Vienna, and our government didn't even bother to show up. They didn't even bother to show up and hear what was being said, despite them having representatives based there. And far from working towards nuclear disarmament, they're actually stockpiling more and have stopped providing public figures for the nuclear arsenal. And that makes it more difficult for people like myself that have concerns in Parliament and the general public to scrutinise all the expenses that are involved in these weapons. And it's not just our nuclear weapons. We see what's happened in Biden's administration. The UK was now added to the list of countries in this year's 2023 defence budget, where infrastructure investment is underway on special weapons storage sites in the UK, alongside Belgium, Germany, Italy, and the Netherlands, where the US already stores an estimated 100 nuclear bombs. Last year, I actually asked the Defence Secretary about this and whether, as rumoured, he has discussed the potential use of RAF Lakenheath as a special weapons storage site. And this site is actually 100 kilometres northeast of London, and was identified by the director of the Federation of American Scientists. And the Defence Secretary's non-answer to me about this only really, I think, underscores the likelihood that it's probably going to be the case. That they are going to be stored here, as well as increasing the stockpile and hosting US nukes. Another concerning development is our government's lack of transparency around these decisions. In particular, its decision to stop providing public figures. And as I've said, that is a major issue, particularly when you think about the amount, the expense that they place upon the UK when we are experiencing one of our worst cost of living crises. And we're looking at what's happening right across our public sector, and we're looking at how much people are suffering in the country while they continue to ferry public funds into something which actually the public do not want. The dial of public opinion has moved definitely on nuclear weapons, and we're seeing that 59% of the public actually support the government signing up to the TPNW, and more to the point, 77% would actually support a total ban, on all nuclear weapons globally, including 71% of Conservative voters and 83% of Labour voters. So I think that should make a difference in terms of what we're doing. But as I said, we can't challenge these things because we don't know exactly how much is being spent. And in the economic times we find ourselves in, economically challenging times, I think people would have something to say if they knew exactly how much was being spent. The bottom line is that nuclear weapons are not making anyone safe. They're making us more of a target. We need to keep pushing politicians to recognise that. We need to have a grown-up conversation about Trident and its price tag, and an open and democratic conversation, and also about what it's going to take to dismantle nuclear arsenals. Ultimately, it's international solidarity and campaigning, because yes, we definitely have to look to what we're going to do in this country, but we need a complete plan right across the world. It's an affront to human life, and that the most powerful countries, I believe, in the world are pouring more and more resources into these destructive nuclear technologies, whilst we see the burning through climate change, and whilst so many people are dying from preventable diseases, hunger, and whilst we've seen more global poverty, and that global poverty rising at a rate that is the fastest we've seen since the Second World War. So we need to recognise, as I said before, how undemocratic it is, and that our fight has to be global. We can't really build meaningful security or lasting security if we keep stockpiling these weapons of mass destruction. And we need to keep the pressure up on all states to disarm. And in the face of a government that's determined to ratchet up nuclear tensions, it's important for all of us to keep applying that pressure, to keep building those bridges, and to keep fighting for a world where we no longer have any nuclear weapons. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Belle, and thanks for finding the time to join us today. We really appreciate it and your powerful statement there. So turning to our next speaker now, I'd like to welcome Trish Whitham, who is the coordinator of the Nuclear Information Service. Over to you, Trish. You're muted. Okay.
Sorry. Yeah, thank you, Kate, and thank you to the other speakers. Nuclear Information Service is based in Reading, which is close to the atomic weapons establishment in Aldermaston, and we research, monitor, investigate and report on the UK nuclear weapons programme as well as we can, from freedom of information requests, publicly available information and observations. And we have huge resources on our website should you need any further information. So I'm just going to briefly outline some of the current issues, costs and risks that we've identified associated with the UK nuclear weapons programme. As most people are probably aware, the government started a lengthy project to replace our existing nuclear deterrent, which consists of 4 nuclear-powered, nuclear-armed submarines with 1 continuously at sea. Those are the Vanguard class submarines, which are being replaced by the new class, which is the Dreadnought class. And these were expected to come into service in the early 2030s, although the MOD is not giving any exact dates at the moment. Alongside the submarines, there are other projects in the programme, such as a replacement warhead. So we're in the process of building a new nuclear warhead, which will be launched potentially from nuclear, from the Trident missiles on board the submarines. And those Trident missiles are also being modernised. So the whole programme is being referred to as a modernisation programme. And it's a very complex programme. It's spread across many different sites. It's beset with all kinds of problems, including cost increases and delays. The warheads themselves are being built by AWE in Aldermaston, the atomic weapons establishment. They'll be using US components to build those, and it will be following a US design. The submarines are being built by BAE at Barrow-in-Furness. And new infrastructure is required to support the builds, and also new nuclear reactors are required to power the submarines. So Rolls-Royce in Derby are manufacturing the new reactors, and that's where some of the worst problems have been. So they have been beset by constant delays, overruns and vast cost increases. The budget has gone up to about 3 times the original one. I think it's around 3.8 billion is the estimate at the moment for that particular part of the project. And just last month, the Infrastructure and Projects Authority, the IPA, which is a government watchdog monitoring major projects, has rated the reactor building project as red for the 2nd year running. And a red rating, according to the IPA, means successful delivery of the project appears to be unachievable. That's their words. And there now appears to be a serious chance that the problems in Derby will delay the in-service date for the first Dreadnought submarine, which would obviously mean the Vanguard subs staying in service much longer than ever intended. And it's not just the reactor project that's in trouble. All of the government's major nuclear projects are currently rated red or amber. Amber meaning that significant issues already exist requiring management attention. Or the rating for the project in some cases has been redacted by the MOD. So we can only wonder why that might be. So this will almost certainly mean even greater costs and delays right across the government's nuclear weapons upgrade programmes. And looking at costs in general, in 2019, our report, Trouble Ahead, is calculated the total cost of the UK's nuclear weapons programme up to 2070 to be in the region of 172 billion. But this was an intentionally conservative figure and fully accepting the MOD's own cost estimates at face value. So, yeah. And then earlier this year, the government announced another 3 billion of additional funding for its nuclear programme. So ever escalating costs and delays obviously bring their own risks. At Nuclear Information Service, we also have concerns about the UK nuclear weapons programme and our NPT obligations. We're concerned that the UK doesn't appear to be complying with any of the steps signed up to in the 2000 and the 2010 review conferences. In particular, we're concerned about the new trend away from transparency, something we were once praised for. And since 2021, the UK is no longer publishing figures for its numbers of operational and deployed warheads, which is contrary to the principle of transparency that was agreed in 2010. An increase in numbers of warheads was also announced in 2021. This reverses decades of reductions that were in line with NPT, while the announcement was an increase of around 40% in the published upper limit, the cap from, the cap is, I think, from 180 up to 260 warheads. The observable activities at sites clearly suggest that the actual numbers of warheads are now being increased. The 2010 NPT review conference also included a commitment to the irreversibility of steps taken towards disarmament. But we're concerned that previously disarmed warheads may now be being brought back into service in order to quickly increase the stockpile up towards the new upper limit. And what does that say about the UK's attitude towards its commitments to the NPT and to the non-nuclear weapons state signatories? And on the question of nuclear weapons and real security, a recent study we conducted into attitudes of the non-nuclear weapons state signatories identified 172 member states expressing concerns about modernisation programmes of the nuclear weapons states. The 2010 review conference also recognised that non-nuclear states do have a legitimate interest in constraining these modernisation programmes. Modernisation is essentially building new weapons and does not comply with the spirit of the treaty. It will not help to rid the world of the dangers. And if the nuclear armed states are not as committed in practice to the treaty as they claim to be, this makes everyone in the world less secure. Thanks.
Thanks very much indeed, Trish. That's great. A lot of food for thought there. And then finally, we turn to Dr. Rebecca Johnson, Vice President of CND, and many other responsibilities. Rebecca, over to you.
Thank you very much, Kate. And I'm really pleased that CND is hosting this important webinar, and very glad that Ambassador Aidan Liddle was able to make time to join us. It's very important that we do hear from those who speak on our behalf in the NP and in diplomatic circles in general. And our MPs also, Bell gave a very commanding understanding of what these security challenges are. And it's concerning to me that the ministers gave non-answers to Bell's questions as an MP in the House of Commons. And finally, I'm very grateful to Trish for this extremely sobering update on how British taxpayers' hard-earned money is being wasted on nuclear weapons that we cannot, and indeed that we must not, ever use. So when we're talking about securities, I like Aidan, I really don't like that term hard security issues because I don't believe in it. All security issues are incredibly important and also generally very linked, inextricably linked. And I want to really look at how we recognize that nuclear weapons play an incredibly important and dangerous role, not only in fostering insecurity, in promoting certainly behaviors that lead to the proliferation and ambitions to proliferate nuclear weapons, but also through the high levels of military expenditure and arming that go along with nuclear arsenals of the 9 nuclear armed states that there are in the world, and as Bell said, with over 12,000 nuclear weapons between them. So we have a huge climate bootprint that nuclear weapons are part of, that our huge military levels of spending, one of the largest in the world, contributes to, and where nuclear power, maybe that's the right word for it, certainly the nuclear energy for power production is actually a real problem within all attempts to prevent proliferation, but it's also a problem because it's constantly trotted out as an answer to the need that we are increasingly recognizing not to use fossil fuel technologies any longer, to really cut those out. So I want to look at, and I draw your attention to my briefing that I put a little link to in the chat, making the NPT work for global security, because I want to look at this nexus of security threats we face and then what we can do about them. I'm not going to spend very much time on talking about the problem, because I've written about those a lot, and we are indebted to Scientists for Global Responsibility, for example, in all of their work on military emissions. And so I just want to draw attention with a couple of those about the escalating military industrial emissions, the fact that they're very closely correlated with the nuclear armed states and the largest military arsenals as a whole, and that we need to be addressing those. And I'm going to run through the kind of headlines from the briefing that I brought out, which is NPT related, because what I attempt to do is look at what governments, not just the nuclear armed states, although a huge responsibility lies on the nuclear armed states, and as a nuclear armed states, a huge responsibility lies on the UK, that, as others before me have just said, they are not picking up in an appropriate way on transparency, on failing to implement steps that they agreed to in 2000, and again in different versions in 2010, apart from their verification project, which I applaud, and I wish it was made more of. They have, you know, it is one area where the UK and Aldermaston can actually contribute very positively towards security, but it has a tiny budget compared with the work that Aldermaston does on the nuclear warheads, on making more and researching and so on. So the headlines I'm going to look at is end proliferation, implement existing agreements, and by that I mean implement Article 6 of the NPT. Don't just talk about it, don't just promise. We've heard the promises for over 50 years now from various nuclear armed states, including the UK. But I also mean the existing agreements like the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons and some of the existing UN Security Council resolutions that do deal with nuclear safety and security issues. I want to see these things as being integrated together as part of a nuclear security disarmament and non-proliferation regime that has all of those elements in them. It's absolutely pointless, and in fact it's very counterproductive to force at least some of the nuclear armed states to be refusing to engage at all in the TPNW. France and China didn't join the NPT for its first 20 years or more. And yet, in fact, they were dragged into, in some cases, implementing more and more of it until they finally signed up in 1992, in time for the NPT to be renewed. So that's what I mean by end proliferation. We've got to implement all the existing agreements that can help us tackle the ambitions and the programs that lead to further escalation and the further proliferation. And I also mean vertical, the modernization that the nuclear armed states, all of them, are still proceeding with, as well as horizontal, trying to prevent new nuclear armed states. Preventing nuclear escalation and use that can lead to nuclear war. This is the second headline, and this is very much in our thoughts in the context of the Ukraine war and all that entails. So it's vital for all governments, not only nuclear armed states, to recognize it's in their security interests to undertake things like to affirm the inadmissibility of the use of nuclear weapons that the G20 came up with, but also to urgently commit unilaterally in statements at the NPT and beyond, not to use or threaten or enable nuclear weapons to be used under any circumstances. We must be clear that, as many states have been saying at the NPT conference already, very strong statement from South Africa I noticed, nuclear sharing, whether done within NATO or done by Russia to Belarus, violate the NPT, and those practices, as well as the policies that lead to those practices, have to be ended. And that relevant governments, and by that I mean certain nuclear armed states like the UK and the NATO states and Russia, that cling to keeping the possibility of the first use of nuclear weapons alive in their policies, they have got to publicly rule out the first use of nuclear weapons and practically take active steps to de-alert and take all nuclear weapons off prompt and hair trigger alert configurations.
Rebecca, just to say you've had 8 minutes.
Okay, I'm going to just bring in. So then we talk about eliminating nuclear weapons. And again, I'm actually going to go for this deadline set by the civil society networks that spoke out at the G7 Hiroshima meeting. Let's set 2045 as the elimination deadline. We know they can be eliminated with political will by within 10 years, even the biggest arsenals. And then I have a series of steps that are completely familiar to you. I won't go through them because they were pretty much agreed in 2010 and then watered down a bit, but agreed in 2000 with the 13 steps. A lot of these steps and measures were absolutely agreed by the UK and the NPT 5, as well as all the non-nuclear countries in the NPT. And then I have a number of things that address the climate, as well as nuclear challenges, both ideas for treaties to move or agreements to move forward, and what governments should be doing, including, and I'll finish on these two, reduce, measure, and publish annual data on national military greenhouse gas pollution, emissions, in other words, and end investments and subsidies for companies that develop, make, and sell inhumane weaponry, from automatic firearms and bombs to nuclear missiles and other weapons of mass destruction. I'll leave you with those and hope that I can talk a little bit more if questions come up about some more of the connections and ideas for moving forward. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much indeed, Rebecca, and I'm sure there'll be ample time for you to elaborate further. So we've had a number of questions in so far, and not surprisingly, Ambassador, some of those are directly asking things to you. So I'm going to kick off with a couple of those, and of course, other colleagues on the panel feel free to contribute too. So first of all, we have a question from Commander Robert Forsyth. He says, could the Ambassador say what has been the UK's most significant action in, say, the last 10 years that contributes to nuclear disarmament under Article 6 of the NPT? So if I could put that to you first, Aidan. Did you hear that? Or have we lost Aidan? Sarah in our tech team, is Aidan Liddle still? I can see a picture, but is he frozen?
I'm not sure. I don't know more than the fact that his screen's blank.
Okay, well, I'll hold off on that one. So until we're aware that he's back. So if you could alert me, Sarah, if that is the case, and I'll go to another question. So scrolling down, okay, I've got one from Tom Cuthbert here. He says, how do nuclear disarmers convey complex issues in everyday language? So I'm thinking, Rebecca, that's pretty much one for you, first of all, there. Oh, you're muted.
I've just seen that Aidan has come back on, and to be honest, if you did tell us at the beginning that your Wi-Fi might be ropey, so maybe Kate could actually pose the question that Rob Forsyth asked and come straight to you before you drop out again.
Thank you. Sorry. Yes, my Wi-Fi collapsed just as you were wrapping up, I think, Rebecca. Sorry.
Did you hear? Oh, okay. So, Aidan, so we've got a few questions that are specifically aimed at you. I'm going to put one of them to you first of all, and it's from Commander Robert Forsyth. He says, could the Ambassador say what has been the UK's most significant action in, say, the last 10 years that contributes to nuclear disarmament under Article 6 of the NPT? And then I'm going to put one more to you, so in case anything happens to you subsequently.
All right.
This is from Tom Unterreiner, who happens to be chair of CND, who's been there in Vienna too. He says, how does the UK's disarmament ambassador explain that whilst potential breaches of the NPT by China, DPRK, Iran and Russia were addressed a number of times in the plenary debate, similar potential breaches by the UK were not addressed in the same way, if at all? So if you would give us your thoughts on both of those, please.
Thank you. Yeah. So, I mean, both of these questions hinge on what the UK's legal obligations under the NPT are. So the obligation under Article 6 is to negotiate in good faith on effective measures on nuclear disarmament and cessation of the arms race, and working towards a treaty on general complete disarmament. So the obligation fundamentally under Article 6 is to negotiate. Obviously, you're negotiating to a particular end, and you want to achieve that negotiation, that objective. But the obligation under the UK, legally speaking, we have absolutely fulfilled. We negotiated the CTBT, which was also a fundamental objective baked into the NPT. This is the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban. We have been ready since 1995 to negotiate a treaty banning the production of fissile material for nuclear weapons. We stand ready to do that. There's one or two countries in the Conference on Disarmament, which is the body where that would happen, which are not prepared to do that, which is why we're in a stalemate on that. I think we also, we've done a lot of work to answer Robert Forsyth's question. We've done a lot of work in the meantime to try and support eventual negotiations. Rebecca very kindly mentioned the work we've done on verification, and I think that is a very practical contribution to negotiations, as we saw during the 80s when the negotiations on the test ban were frozen. The work that was done on sort of technological and scientific approaches to verifying an eventual treaty really paid off when the political window opened in the 90s to negotiate that treaty, and helped it get over the line very quickly, really, considering the complexity of the treaty. We're trying to do the same thing now with the fissile material cutoff treaty, and through verification work and various other things. And some of the work we've done on transparency, and more recently on irreversibility, which are the other two principles that underpin the disarmament obligations of the NPT, I think are also designed to do that. Pivoting to the second question about why others' potential breaches of the NPT have been mentioned and not ours, I suppose it's because other countries don't think we're breaching the NPT. To put it simply. I mean, clearly people would like negotiations to be going faster than they are. I would like negotiations to be going faster than they are. You know, that's what I'm here to do. But you know, to come back to some of the themes that perhaps came up in some of the other presentations, this is not something the UK can do unilaterally. It's been a constant principle of the UK's for many decades that unilateral disarmament from the UK does not actually make the world safer. And you know, I don't think many people believe that the UK and the US and France giving up their weapons while Russia and China maintain theirs would make the world any safer than it is now, and in fact probably quite the reverse. While we're talking about legal obligations, I just want to address the point that Rebecca raised about nuclear sharing. NATO's nuclear sharing arrangements do not violate the NPT. They do not violate Articles 1 and Article 2 because the US maintains control and command of its weapons and custody of its weapons at all times, even when they're deployed across their borders. Our complaint about Belarus is not that it's violating the NPT. It's that it's violating the Budapest Memorandum, which was the undertakings that Russia and Belarus, Ukraine, and Moldova gave when they gave up their inherited nuclear arsenal in 1994, and doing this at the height of a ongoing war in Ukraine, really, which Belarus is complicit in and supporting, is not likely to contribute to stability and de-escalation, which is what we all want to see. So we have to separate those two issues out, but it's very clear, it's very important to be clear that the NATO arrangements which predate the NPT do not violate that treaty. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Aidan. I'm sure other colleagues, well, I see Rebecca's indicating, but rather than getting into just a little head-to-head there, I'm going to take some other questions and you'll have an opportunity later on, but I don't want the audience not to have their full voice. So I'm going to go to quite topical one from Paula Shaw. Paula says, as there may be a general election in 2024, would it be worthwhile for candidates to answer the question regarding transparency and state when the public figures will be reinstated? So that's a question around campaigning, potential election campaigning, and what candidates may say about this. So, Rebecca, do you want to give a quick thought on that before I go to the other speakers?
Thank you. Yes, good question. And I'm very practical minded, and so I don't just listen to what the rhetoric and the PR that comes from governments is about, but I actually look at what are the facts on the ground, what is actually happening. And I think that Paula's question comes to that it's no good having, presentational things saying, well, actually, we are committed to transparency and irreversibility, which I know were two of the watchwords of the certainly the general debate statement by the UK earlier this week. I haven't seen the nuclear disarmament one come out yet, and I'm looking forward to reading it when it does. And so, yes, I think it's an important question that just as it's important that we count and publish as well as reducing all our military carbon emissions, and recognize that counting and publishing are part of the process of being accountable to the electorate. So yes, Paula, this is a good question to be asking all of the MPs and candidates in the run-up to the election.
Thanks very much. Trish, do you have a comment to add on that?
Yes, I think anything that gets the public thinking about the fact that we are still a nuclear weapons state, what's going on with the nuclear weapons program. The majority of people are not really very aware of it, so asking candidates to give their position would be a really big help. I know, obviously, with the Oppenheimer film out, people are going to have a bit more of an interest than they may have had before, so it might be a good time as well to put that forward.
Yeah, I think we'll certainly consider adding that to the survey of candidates' views that we do from CND. Aidan, would you like to comment on that too?
I'm a civil servant, not a politician, so I think I'll leave that question to others.
Okay, right. Okay, right. So going to the next one. This is another one for you, Aidan. This is from Ruth Brown. Ruth says, since the UK and all G20 affirm that the use, I think that's the use of threat or threat of nuclear weapons is inadmissible, what is the point of the UK having them?
Well, I think, as I was saying earlier, the point of the UK having them is to deter the most existential threats to the UK. Obviously, we never want to be in a position where we have to use or threaten to use nuclear weapons. The point of nuclear deterrence is to prevent crises escalating to that sort of point. As far as the G20 statement is concerned, that was really sort of very much in the context of Ukraine, and we certainly don't see Ukraine as having a nuclear, or the war in Ukraine as having a nuclear element. And I think what Russia is trying to do through its rhetoric, or sort of saber rattling, as I see it described in the media, is to try and sort of coerce Ukraine and those of us outside Ukraine who support Ukraine's territorial integrity and independence from fighting for that. So I think the message of the G20 really was that Russia should not be using the threat of nuclear weapons as a coercive means to achieve its ends in Ukraine, and that's certainly something we wholeheartedly agree with.
Thanks very much. Right, now this is a slightly different type of one here. This is especially for those of you who've seen Oppenheimer, will remember the discussions going on in the Manhattan Project about whether the H-bomb should be progress made on the H-bomb, so much more powerful than the A-bomb. He says, at a Peace News Zoom a few days ago, it was said that papers show that Churchill wanted the H-bomb to be on the nuclear table in order to hold back the USA from nuclear war. Is Britain still trying to hold the USA back? He says, I wish someone was holding back on weapons. So I guess that's a question around the nuclear special relationship there. Would anyone like to comment on that? I don't know if you've got any insights, Aidan, around because of course I note that the Mutual Defence Agreement is coming up for renewal next year, the end of 2024. What's going on there in that special nuclear relationship? Thoughts, anyone?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the relationship between the UK and the US obviously is very close one. Obviously the warhead itself, the UK nuclear warhead, is a UK designed and built capability, but clearly because we use the same Trident 2 D5 missile as the US, and because the warhead needs to fit on the missile, there is obviously a great deal of technical cooperation that goes between the UK and the US in the warhead, in the nuclear realm. I mean, But of course, when you're talking about the use of nuclear weapons, each country has its own nuclear doctrine. I'm not going to try and speak for the US one, but it's all sort of laid out very clearly in the nuclear posture review. We basically have the same overall conception of the role nuclear weapons play in our security policy, which, as I said at the beginning, is a very unique and special and extreme one, and quite a niche one, but one that underpins a lot of the other stuff. I think the UK, US, and France really have a similar but not identical conception of the role nuclear weapons play in our security.
Thanks very much. Rebecca or Trish there, who would like to go?
I'd like to jump in on this because I think it's a really important issue, and I have to say that I think that Blair, in his autobiography, actually perhaps inadvertently put it rather clearly in front of us when George W. Bush wanted to launch the invasion of Iraq, despite the fact that no WMD had been found by any inspectors. And despite the fact that there was not a majority for the second UN Security Council resolution, Blair, in his memoir, talked about, on balance, knowing that the UK, as a nuclear weapon state, needed to stick closely with the US as its ally, because our nuclear armed status, if you like, in practical as well as political terms, depended utterly on the United States. He didn't, of course, put it in quite that language, but that's the ultimate of what he said. And then he also said, and having nuclear weapons also gave him a sense of freedom of action. And this is the very dangerous aspect. It's the flip side, if you like, of the so-called promises of deterrence, where we have actually seen that these don't either work. We've seen more clearly maybe than we've seen in the last 40 or 50 years through the Putin's invasion of Ukraine. But it is that Putin launched that invasion also because he believed that having nuclear weapons was going to give him a freedom of action to go after and invade and occupy this neighboring country, Ukraine, that did not have nuclear weapons, because the Russian nuclear weapons were calculated as holding back NATO. And I think we have to recognize these are the realities of what nuclear weapons really mean and how they are really used in the heads and therefore the policies of nuclear armed leaders. And so the shorter, that was a longer answer, and the short answer is that I think the very fact that the UK is so closely tied in with US ambitions means that we go along with things that, you know, 1 million people in the streets knew was wrong, and a lot more that didn't march, that most of our leaders knew that was wrong. Most of our journalists, certainly most of our scientists who worked on chemical and biological and nuclear weapons knew it was wrong. But the politicians of the day dragged us because George W. Bush had his own agenda and wanted to pursue war.
Thanks very much, Rebecca. Trish, something to add there?
I don't think I can really add any more to that. No, I think that was very comprehensive, Rebecca. Thanks.
Okay, thanks very much. Right, I'm going to put a couple of questions now that are around campaigning, but not explicitly linked to that. I'm wondering, Aidan, you look very static there, so I'm not sure. Oh no, you're there, just sitting very still. That's good. Okay, so I've got two from Tom Cuthbert. So Tom says, first of all, nuclear weapons have many more consequences than assumed deterrence. How long can the costs of nuclear weapons on the UK taxpayer be sustained without protest when the detailed costs are not clear or accounted for? So I guess that relates to the transparency question as well as the budget, so to speak. So that's one. And then his second one is, how do nuclear disarmers convey complex issues in everyday language? A crucial thing for those of us on the campaigning front. But we'd love to hear your views on those as well. Aidan, who would like to go first on those?
Maybe I should pick up, because I was just beginning to answer Tom's question when Aidan came back in view. And it's an important question, Tom, so thank you for that. I think one of the ways, for a start, who is your audience? Like, you know, if you're leafleting outside Oppenheimer, that's a really good opportunity. Have the leaflet be relatively simple. And just raise some questions. Questions are an incredibly important way of engaging. I don't think it's so much the complexity of the language, although we do have to steer clear of the euphemisms. Things like the word sort of deterrence is often very confusing to people, because it means one thing in real life and it means something else in nuclear theology. But I actually find, ask them what they're concerned about, and then sort of tailor what you answer. So if they say, well, I just heard there's 12,000 nuclear weapons in the world, in you know, and or that the UK has you know, whatever the number currently is, and maybe Aidan can actually tell us, nuclear weapons, then you can start engaging on that. And one of the things is to say, well, of course, what we need to be going towards is zero. But the problem that we really need to tackle is that just one nuclear weapon used against a city somewhere is a humanitarian catastrophe. And then just remind them what that means in Hiroshima and Nagasaki terms. Remind them then that the nuclear weapons nowadays on Trident and in the arsenals of quite a lot of others are much larger than those used in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And that actually relates to the H-bomb issue as well. The thermonuclear weapons were able to be more compact and smaller and go more onto the missiles, but with much, much bigger explosive power and therefore much higher death rate. And then just bring it back to ordinary, just the 40 warheads on one Trident, UK Trident armed submarine, if fired at half a dozen cities, is enough to cause that uplifting of the dust clouds that will entomb the earth for at least a period of time and cause nuclear winter. And what does that mean? It means mass starvation around the world. And it's those kinds of things, but get them, ask their questions, and then pick up on the things they say they're worried about. And I think that generally seems to work.
Thanks very much. Who would like to go next on those two?
Yeah, well, Nuclear Information Service is not a campaign organisation, so we leave that to CND and ICAN and such, but we will continue to research on the costs and to publish those. So we will always aim to have up-to-date cost available as far as we can, and you can access that from our website anytime.
Thanks very much. And Aidan, over to you.
Well, I don't think it's for me to give advice on campaigning to seasoned campaigners, but on the sort of the first question, again, that's more of a sort of political one, I think. So I'll leave that to others to judge.
Okay, so just on that, if anyone's interested in campaigning around that, that's on the costs of Trident and nuclear weapons and the kind of opportunity cost for spending elsewhere within the United Kingdom. We have a couple of campaigning tools around this. We have information on wages, not weapons, and we also have the Nurses Not Nukes campaign, which understandably is very popular. And I'm hoping that Sarah might put a couple of links to those popular campaigns in the chat for people. So let's see, we've got a little bit of time left, so I'm going to highlight a couple of things before I then come back to the speakers for their final contributions. Elizabeth in chat has drawn attention to the statement. I think I was aware of this yesterday, that the strong statement from several editors of medical journals that they've put out, their concern about nuclear weapons. So that's certainly one worth looking at. I think there was an interesting article in the BMJ very recently, which of course people may be wanting to see there. There's also a contribution from Phil Webber. I think this is in response to Rebecca's point about the Ukraine war. Phil is from Scientists for Global Responsibility. He says, I think that it is a crucial point that Putin used, it quotes, his nuclear deterrence threat as an umbrella for the invasion. So this is an example of nuclear weapons making us less safe. So that's an interesting point there. So please do look at the chat, everyone. Olin Jamieson, who's chair of Scottish CND, says another cost of nuclear weapons is the constant risk of accident and incidents such as the discharges of radioactivity into the Gairloch. Another important type of transparency concerns accidents and incidents, but again, this is not happening. For example, Annex B, Defence Nuclear Assurance, used to be, but is now not in the public domain and marked limited distribution. Michael Fallon, when Secretary of State for Defence, admitted that reports were withheld for internal political reasons. Rob Edwards quotes Michael Fallon saying they were not in the public domain for fear of public concern about safety. And this is a question for you, actually, Aidan. As a civil servant, would you advise transparency? So please do, everyone, take a look at that. And then, yes, so there's questions come up in the Q&A box related to those things. So please do take a look there. And then final thing I'll read out from Michael Orgel before I invite you all to come back. Oppenheimer regretted his work in later years. One physicist, Professor Joseph Rotblat, quit the Manhattan Project as soon as it was clear Germany would not win World War II, and went on to lead the work that resulted in London becoming a nuclear-free zone. If nukes are used in the future, it will be too late for regret. How can we avoid this situation developing? So I really thank everyone for making these very useful and important contributions here, really stimulating debate. So I'm going to ask Aidan now if you'd like to come back on any of those things and add anything to the contribution that you've made. So we've got time, so don't cut your remarks short.
I think I'll probably just limit myself to 3 points, if I may. One is on this point about what Russia is doing in Ukraine and the role nuclear weapons are playing in Putin's thinking. I mean, it's very important to distinguish between coercion and deterrence. These are two different things. And I agree absolutely with the point that it seems to be the case that Putin was assuming, or at least I think you can reasonably infer that Putin was using Russia's possession of nuclear weapons, or perhaps assuming that Russia's possession of nuclear weapons would give him freedom of action in Ukraine. And when things started going wrong, the threat of using nuclear weapons, uttered by whoever, would somehow sort of cover for the failure of his invasion. That's coercion. Using the threat of nuclear weapons to get someone to do something that they don't want to do, or to comply with your sort of aggressive demands is coercion. That is a different thing from deterrence. And as I said earlier on, the fundamental purpose of the UK's nuclear weapons is to preserve peace and deter aggression. So this is a different sort of thing, and I think it's important to sort of get that distinction clear. The second point was around transparency. I mean, you know, transparency is an incredibly important principle in negotiations on nuclear weapons and in the NPT context. It's important for two reasons. One, because negotiations amongst the nuclear weapon states and with the other non-nuclear weapon states on nuclear disarmament need to proceed from a basis of transparency. You need to know amongst, you know, the nuclear weapon states what you're negotiating on. You need to know what you're negotiating away, and you need to have an idea of, you know, what the other states are doing to follow through on what you've negotiated. All of that requires transparency. So that's one reason why it's important. The second reason it's important is indeed, you know, for accountability reasons. You know, in a democratic country like ours, governments do owe accountability to Parliament, to the public, and in the international context, we owe accountability to the other states who have signed up to the same treaty as we have. Now, of course, on all elements of transparency, there is always going to be limits to that. Nothing in life is ever completely, you know, open to everybody. There are national security constraints. You know, transparency cannot, you know, sort of give our adversaries carte blanche on what we're doing. That would undermine our security. And of course, we have non-proliferation obligations as well. We can't sort of be transparent about things that would allow others to or enable the spread of nuclear weapons. So there are obviously constraints on transparency, but I think, you know, the principle of transparency and increasing transparency is really important. Now, we, as others have mentioned, we have stopped publishing certain elements of the information that we used to publish. That's because, you know, a degree of ambiguity is important when you're calculating deterrence. But within those sorts of constraints, we are really committed to being as transparent as possible, and it's something that we're trying to encourage other nuclear weapon states to be as well. I mean, for example, China, who is, we think, on course to about triple their nuclear arsenal, but have not published any information about it at all, which is very worrying. So that was the second point. The third point I just wanted to make very briefly was just to correct something that was mentioned earlier on, I think both by Trish and by Bell, this figure of 40% as an increase in the nuclear weapons stockpile of the UK. I don't know where this figure has come from, but I don't think it's accurate. The UK used to have a stockpile ceiling of 225. We now have a stockpile ceiling of 260. That does not equal 40%. We had an aspiration when our stockpile ceiling was 225 to go down to a ceiling of 180 by the mid-2020s. That was never actually our ceiling. It was an aspiration. We've not been able to meet it, and the world has changed since then. But even that is not a 40% increase. And of course, none of these figures are the numbers of warheads that we actually have. This is the limit that we impose on ourselves that we will not go beyond. So I don't know where that 40% figure has come from, but it's not accurate. And I think we should be careful of repeating it. But the fundamental point is that the UK, while nuclear weapons exist, we have said that we will remain a nuclear weapon state for the reasons I said earlier on. But we are absolutely clear that we will maintain our nuclear weapon stockpile at the minimum level which we deem to be credible and consistent with deterrence. So, you know, both elements of that are important, minimum and credible. But we really will try to keep the stockpile at the minimum level that we calculate has the deterrent effect that we require it to have. Thanks.
Thanks very much indeed, Aidan. And then Trish, over to you for any final comments you wish to make.
Yeah, I'm not sure where that 40% came from, and I will check that and make sure that it's correct before we repeat it. But we are obviously concerned about the rise, whatever percentage it may be. I'm sure you have the accurate figure somewhere, Aidan, the accurate percentage. Yeah, just to say that really Nuclear Information Service, as I've said, is a research organisation. We're not a campaign group. We do monitor and investigate the information that we can find about the UK nuclear weapons programme, and we publish it on our website, and that's the best place to go. We've done a very in-depth report on the new nuclear warhead. It's about 70 pages and it covers all sorts of aspects, everything connected with it and with the US programme as well. So if anyone's interested in getting the deep detail, please have a look on our website. And yeah, thank you to all the other speakers then for all the interesting questions.
Thanks very much indeed, Trish. Rebecca, over to you for your concluding remarks.
Yes, thank you. I'm really having a problem with the UK having come to this NPT, and the two key sort of aspects that it was again trying to say, look how wonderful we are, were transparency and irreversibility, and then fingers being pointed at others, when the integrated review of 2021 and then furthered in the updated 2023 version of the integrated review, both really kind of sliced through, let me say actually reversed, almost the only steps that the UK had credibly taken in the last 10 years, which was the question that was asked right at the beginning by Rob Forsyth, I think, which were in transparency, making a lot of claims on transparency from 2000 onwards, and claims on irreversibility. And to me, it's not about whether a 40% number is right. We've got the figures. It is actually that a ceiling that was a lid that was put on the arsenal that was supposed to keep going down until it was getting to zero, that's the meaning of irreversibility, actually was put up again. And with the transparency, again, what's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. I'm afraid that either transparency is a stabilizing element in international relations, which is what the UK argued certainly ever since 2000, or it isn't, which is what the UK is now saying, you know, ambiguity is meant to be good for deterrence. It's actually very dangerous. It greatly increases the risks of miscalculation and mistakes. And those are the things that are far more likely to lead to the launching of nuclear weapons. It's the miscalculations and the, you know, and you know, combined with weapons being on hair trigger alert. So I'm just going to take a few minutes now to just finish off my remarks with a few key points that I think are actually irreversible if they're undertaken, and I recommend that they need to be. It is removing all short and medium range, so-called tactical, so-called theatre nuclear weapons now, which means reinstating actually the INF treaty in some form. I'm not, you know, I think it can be done by agreements, and it needs to include China at the very least. But we need to stop even thinking in terms of some nuclear weapons being tactical. Any nuclear weapon is strategic in intent, and if used would be absolutely catastrophic in humanitarian terms, but also would be strategic in impact. So of course we want the US and Russia to take the arsenals down further and faster, and you know, I've got some suggestions on that. We do actually need to outlaw attacks on nuclear facilities and power plants. I'm hoping the UK would agree with me on that. And until that is turned into some kind of sort of legal prohibition, certainly what we need is all governments should be declaring that they will not attack nuclear power plants under any circumstance, and will do all within their power to prevent such attacks being carried out by others. We need to halt nuclear weapons developments, testing and production. If we want to be irreversible, this is what we should be doing. These are the steps. You can't take the steps to take some nuclear weapons away and then repurpose the warhead materials into the next modernized version. So this is what is actually meant by irreversible, and it has to be done now, because 12,000 is far too many, and refining 12,000 is just dangerous and leads us into nuclear war. And again, these are things that have been agreed to, but they now have to be done. And the UK should and can actually take the lead. And then we also, as part of the developing effective technologies and systems for verifying nuclear disarmament, have to recognize how some of these are going to interface with the new technologies that are both providing further threats when combined with the nuclear weapons. I'm thinking cyber, I'm thinking nano, I'm thinking the automaticity of weapon systems increasingly, that we're going down the kind of killer robots writ large. There's no reason why killer robots wouldn't some point in the future turn into killer nuclear armed robots. We have to get a handle on these and put a lid on them before we have the nuclear weapons being used. And then everybody wakes up, or at least all those who are left, wake up and go, oh my God, that's the regret. The only way, the question we were asked by, I think, Michael Ogle, how can we not have the regret? The only way not to have regrets is to pursue nuclear disarmament further, faster, to do everything we can, whether we are government representatives or civil society, in order to bring the numbers down, but also in order actually to put all these other prevention steps into place. The steps in my briefing are fully consistent with the TPNW. And that's really important to me, because that provides the legal basis for where we go to from now. Not the NPT, although the NPT still has an important role to play. It's a 50-year-old treaty that the nuclear armed states themselves have eroded and diminished, as the UN Under-Secretary General herself stated in her when she opened this NPT PrepComm. So we need to move down that, and we need to listen to those from the nuclear testing, nuclear test sites, the Hibakusha from nuclear use. We have to listen to them about what nuclear weapons actually do. And we have to stop the warhead convoys unless they are simply going to Burfield to be dismantled, and they are not going to be filled up with more warheads to go up to Coolport. These are the steps that need to be taken by our government, but we need to set an example. We're not. We're just jogging along with, just like Putin with the rhetoric, calling it an invasion, just an operation. No, call things what they are, and then stop them happening and becoming worse. And that's my last point.
Thanks very much indeed, Rebecca. Before I close, as there have been questions about where the over 40% figure came from, which of course is a figure that CND uses. So I just want to explain to people that all figures that we use are verifiable, and in this case it came from the House of Commons Library report itself. It says, while the UK remains committed to a credible minimum nuclear deterrent, the review concludes that the current security environment necessitates a move away from the previous decision in the 2010 SDSR to reduce the UK's nuclear stockpile to no more than 180 warheads by the mid-2020s. The UK will now move towards an overall nuclear weapons stockpile of no more than 260 warheads, an increase of just over 40%. So, Trish, you had concerns about that, where that came.
Can I come back on that, because even if it comes from the House of Commons Library, I'm afraid it's not true. The UK's previous warhead stockpile was 225. It's now 260. I'm not a great mathematician, but that's not 40%. We had an aspiration. Hang on, let me finish on this, Kate, because it's important. We had an aspiration. The 2010 SDSR said that we had an aspiration to reduce that cap to 180 by the mid-2020s. We did not actually reduce that cap. As we all know, the world has got worse, I'm afraid, and minimum credible deterrence meant we had to raise it rather than reduce it. But the cap was 225, and now it's 260, and that's the fundamental figures we have to base this discussion on.
Okay, so thanks very much, Aidan. Do take that up with the.
But it's still an increase, and it's still a problem.
That's okay, Rebecca. we all will interpret the figures. So big thank you to everyone. Big thank you to Aidan for coming and engaging with our perspectives. Big thank you to Trish, and of course to Nuclear Information Service for all the really robust and rigorous research that you do. And of course, as ever, Rebecca Johnson, a huge thank you to you for all the work that you do in your many capacities. And in particular, can I recommend the new briefing that you've produced to everybody? So please do look at that. And finally, a big thank you to Sarah behind the scenes there. And Sarah will be putting this webinar up on our website, so you'd all have the opportunity to go back and hear the very, very interesting discussion. So thanks everyone for joining us today, and hope to see you all again very soon. Bye-bye.
Thanks everyone.
Thanks, Kate,
Pleasure as always.
everyone.
Bye.
Bye.